As a photojournalist trying to cover Syria, much of what I was focusing on was the impact of the conflict on civilians. And the way that I went about covering it was mostly, I mean, in Syria you really had no choice. You had to stay amongst the people in the opposition areas. So I was always amongst civilians. And it was really about telling their stories because many of them were trying to go about their daily lives, even amidst the violence. And what I wanted to do was just to portray their reality, what they were living through, the power cuts, and also trying to find food or even pay for food, and also particularly the effect of the weapons being used in the war on children and adult civilians. So I spent some time in a hospital that was being run by doctors who had previously never seen war wounded, and having to very quickly adapt to the situation to become a surgeon, essentially. And so I thought that these transitions within the civilian population were really important to show because it tried to, I guess, portray them as, being really not just victims, but trying to make their own lives as normal as possible in this situation. It has really changed since 2012, when I initially went in the early months of 2012. We were really welcomed very warmly by the Syrians, and they really understood the value of having foreign journalists there reporting on their situation. However, it started to change because, very understandably, they became more frustrated with the international community and the inaction that was taking place in terms of humanitarian aid and also trying to end the war. So, in a way, I think the foreign journalists became a scapegoat for people's frustrations, and they started to not see the value of us anymore and became a little bit sometimes hostile towards us, and also very fearful for their own security because we were often going up to them and taking their pictures, and they were worried about where these images would be distributed and what effect that might have on them and their families, especially if they were living in an opposition neighborhood. Many times the government would just sweep into a house and make people disappear. Unfortunately, with the news coverage today of what's going on in Syria, it's lacking severely. I mean, there's a lot of very great videos coming from Syrian activists and Syrian journalists, but there has been such a dearth of foreign reporting on the situation, and therefore a lack of understanding of what's going on the ground. So I think what the media has tended towards doing is reporting on the most kind of sensational aspects of the violence, which is ISIS, and almost ignoring what the Assad regime is doing, and also sometimes what atrocities the rebels and the opposition groups or the Islamist groups are perpetrating against civilians and also the other side. So it just becomes kind of, the war has become dumbed down for the public to easily digest, and it's the kind of the big bad guys, and we tend to leave out the more significant details of what's happening. I think that I would still go back to, if I was allowed to go back into Syria today, I would cover something similar to what I was doing before, which was the condition of the civilians, but in particular the children. Because when I was there in 2012, a lot of the children were, foraging through garbage dumps, and previously they had never, this was not something common in Syria at all. People lived a relatively comfortable life, and yet here, 5 years on, they are thrust into the edge of poverty, and the children really bear the brunt. They have lost years and years of schooling, and also have deep psychological wounds that aren't going to be recovered quickly at all. And I think that that is such an important aspect to document, of how these children are growing up in this environment.